A lot of you have probably already followed my series on Satan, so what I'm going to say may not surprise you too much, but I don't think Satan knows my name. I am convinced that Satan has never personally attacked me, nor do I think that he has ever personally attacked or personally sent demons to attack the vast majority of Christians in the world. Despite what our tradition says, Satan isn't in that much power. Right? He is a finite being, meaning he can only be in one place at a time. He is not omniscient like God, meaning he can't know all things at once, right? He can only kind of know what's going on in the present moment, just like any other intelligent being that's not God. And yet, despite my whole series, where I kind of made my position pretty clear why I think that the Bible doesn't support this godlike status that we assign Satan, it can still be confusing to understand what the Bible means when it seems to portray Satan as personally attacking us. So, like I said, if you've been around my Satan series already, what this episode talks about isn't going to be anything necessarily new. And I'll link that series down in the show notes for those who want to check it out. But in that series, at the very end of it, I explored several verses that seem to imply Satan personally attacks us, and taking everything that we know and understand about Satan from the whole of Scripture, trying to better understand what the Bible is actually talking about when it says things like, resist the devil and he'll flee from you. And to remind those of you who may have forgotten, essentially, I believe that the context of those verses is always very clear, that Satan is used as sort of a stand-in for the larger world system that he is responsible for, right? He is the god of this world. Satan is an actual intelligent being, but not every mention of him in the Bible is specifically talking about him functioning as an independent being, but instead, he represents something larger. And so I'm making this episode, and it's kind of a refresher, but it's something that has helped me as I've had further discussions about this. And it is because when I made that episode and when I made that series, I knew that this was true. Like, if you followed the series, I looked at all the biblical evidence, I looked at context. It was very clear that every mention of Satan doesn't always mean the same thing, right? Sometimes the real Satan, sometimes Satan means the world system, an anti-God system, a pagan system, basically anything that is not of God. In a way, we could say is kind of Satan as the god of this world, not that he is a dualistic god or anything like that. But I only recently realized that there is actually a word for that. And as someone who likes when I can put things in boxes and I can have terminology for things, I wanted to, in a way, remake or maybe create an addendum to that previous video and share with you the word that helps us better understand how the Bible can sometimes use Satan in the New Testament, and help you better see that Satan isn't the only time that the Bible uses it. And in fact, it's something we do often. And that word is called a synecdoche. Now, I only, like I said, recently came across this word. A few months ago, I think, we were in small group, and my church has been going through a series on angelology for what you might call adult Sunday school. And it's been taught by Chris Lenore, if you have seen us in teaching videos together on his channel, Theology with Chris Lenore. He's been teaching through this. And so in small group, one night we were sitting around, and I was talking to some of the guys about, okay, so here's what angelic beings are capable of, they're limited and things like that, but why does the Bible seem to imply that Satan directly attacks us? And so we were talking, and I was basically just explaining what I've explained before, that, Satan is kind of a stand-in, right? He's used to represent kind of the larger world system based on the context of that. And so part of that, one of the people in that discussion was a man named Tim Little. I have promoted his book, not promoted, but I've referenced his book, Song of Songs for Singles, in the past. He is the Hebrew professor at Faith Baptist Bible College here in Iowa. But so and I guess I'll plug, he is a member of the Thinklings podcast. If you want, even more Bible nerdy goodness. But anyway, so we were talking and I was explaining this whole thing and I was, trying to, it was a long-winded thing. And so Tim just kind of pipes in. He's like, oh yeah, Satan's just a synecdoche. I'm like, what? He's like, yeah, a synecdoche. So I'm like, what is that? And he explains, oh, well, a synecdoche is just, a part that represents the whole. It's a literary term, if you will. I'm like, huh. So I asked him to spell it for me because that's a really weird word and I completely butchered my attempt to Google it. So, I popped it in my phone and I went home that night, looked it up, and I was looking up just the broad definition of synecdoche. I'm like, huh, yeah, Satan's a synecdoche. All right, that helps. So like I said, doesn't change anything I've ever said, but having a single word to, sum up kind of a longer winded explanation trying to explain the word. So helpful. So that's just really what I want to do, is to help you, if you're watching this episode, understand how the Bible uses Satan sometimes as a literal figure. We don't want to get too weird and too, removing the supernatural from the Bible. Sometimes, yes, the Bible talks about Satan as an actual figure, but also, we can see how the Bible uses Satan as a synecdoche. So what is a synecdoche? How many times can I say synecdoche before it sounds even more gibberish than it actually is? So let's just understand how we see this word played out outside the Bible, right? Understand how this is a common part of our everyday language. So if you're sitting in church and the pastor gets up, he says, hey, it's great to see so many new faces in the crowd this morning. Now, in your mind, do you think, oh, there's a bunch of disembodied, skin flaps floating around. There's so many faces in the audience that aren't attached to anything. Well, no, obviously, that when someone says there's new faces, he's not just saying that there's new skull coverings, but that those faces are a metaphorical way to represent there are new people in the church in this example. You've heard the phrase, many hands make light work. Well, we know that if we truly believe that many hands make light work, we aren't going to go to Amazon and order a box of 500 hands, order them before we, go repair our roof to make things go faster, because then we've just got a stinking pile of hands and probably the FBI asking us some questions. No, we know many hands make light work means that the hands attached to people make things go quicker, right? Having a lot of people helping is much faster than having a single person. Perhaps the clearest example, I think, of how the Bible uses Satan as a synecdoche and how we see it in everyday life is if I were to say, hey, can you grab me a Kleenex? Now, if you were at my house and I said that, you're not going to find name brand Kleenex, because who's got money for name brand Kleenex in this economy, right? But you would know that if I said, grab me a Kleenex, you'd be looking for a box of facial tissues. The name Kleenex represents a whole category of an item. And so the Bible essentially treats Satan like a Kleenex. That's right. If you get nothing else from this, remember that Satan is like a Kleenex. But what I mean by that is that when it's using the proper name of Satan in the Bible, in a lot of the New Testament references, especially in the epistles, it's being used not as that specific proper nouned individual, but that he is a representative of a much larger category that, yes, he is a part of, but he is not all there is to it. So that is how we see synecdoches in everyday life. But do we actually see them in the Bible? I'm making a claim that just because we see a thing in real life, we also see it in the Bible. But if that was the only way that biblical writers used this, literary device, it might be pretty suspicious that I'm making that claim. So do we see throughout the Bible the biblical writers using a part of something to point us towards something much larger? Yes, we do. I'm just going to share three easy examples from the New Testament where we can see this. So the first one, we see it in Matthew chapter 4, verses, for context, we'll do 13 to 16. And we're going to see how here the writer Matthew cites a part of something that is meant to point us towards the whole thing. So starting at verse 13 of Matthew chapter 5, and leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum by the sea, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, so that what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. And here he is quoting Isaiah. The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light, and for those dwelling in the region and shadow of death, on them a light has dawned. So, on its own, that's like, okay, great. Jesus brought illumination, I guess, right? Well, no, that's not quite what Matthew's getting at, because he is using a small piece of one of Isaiah's prophecies to point towards the bigger fulfillment that Christ was playing out. So this one, I'll read the full thing, but just note that what Christ is fulfilling isn't just Christ brought light to this piece of land, but this is where we see the famous thing we read in around Christmas time. A child is born, the government will be on his shoulders. That's what Matthew is pointing out that Christ was going to fulfill in showing us that he is God, right? He is the promised Messiah. So we'll just pick up where Matthew leaves off with the Isaiah quote. So he quotes Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 to 2. But let's now pick up what this synecdoche was meant to draw us toward, right? Not just that light has dawned in this land, but what else did Isaiah prophesy in this whole prophecy? So it says, the Isaiah passage continues, "You have multiplied the nation, you have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as they are glad when they divide the spoil. For the yoke of his burden, and the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. For every boot of the tramping warrior in battle tumult, and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this." So here, whenever Jesus just enters a land, right, Matthew's not like, look, wow, he went into a new territory. No, he's pointing out that Isaiah prophesied not just that a guy would enter this land, but that this guy would be the one. This would be the Messiah who would be called, Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God. Right? Matthew is pointing out that this Jesus that he's talking about is that promised Messiah, the one that people would call Mighty God. So for those religions out there who say, well, Jesus never claimed he was God, this is another great example of how the biblical writers said it very clearly by using the literary styles of that time, right? Matthew is using a synecdoche to say, this is, Matthew's quoting part of the prophecy, but the whole thing is what he has in mind with who Jesus truly is, right? As the Messiah, is our God. Now, another way we say it, or another way we see synecdoches, is in Matthew 27:46. Now, on this passage is where Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And now we see that, right, as modern day readers who are often, unfortunately, disconnected from the Jewish way of thinking and how major the Old Testament was a part of their lives. So when Jesus says that, we think he is just making a statement, right? He's really confused. We say things like, God turned his face away from Christ and he couldn't even bear to look at him, and that Jesus feels alone and abandoned. And that makes sense based on what we're reading. Of course, it doesn't make sense when we think that an all-knowing, all-present God could somehow like pivot away and not have Jesus in his field of vision, because that's not how God's vision works. But digression. If you want to know more about that, you can check out my book, 40 Moments from Christ's Final Days, or you can check out my website, Onward in the Faith, where I've got it all available for free, but I kind of get into what's actually going on the cross there. But for our purposes, why would Jesus on the cross, right, after enduring 3 hours of just, this punishment on the cross and God pouring out his wrath on sin, why did Jesus, of all things that he could have said, say, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because that's a synecdoche. Jesus is saying something that is actually pointing to an entire psalm in the Old Testament. And so I'm not going to read the entire psalm because it's 30 some verses, but I want us to just kind of see what Jesus was pointing us to and see why what he said on the cross wasn't him being confused or questioning God, but instead his statement, right, that seeming question was actually a proclamation of hope for all listeners and for us today, because Christ was proclaiming what he was accomplishing on the cross. So check it out. So again, he is citing Psalm 22. And so that psalm starts off, I'll read the first 2 verses. It says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Again, this is Christ quotes this part of a whole bigger thing. It goes on, why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. So we start that off and it's like, well, that seems like a bummer still, right? Like that's not a hope-filled psalm. Well, as all poetic things are, that's not all we've got. So look at what the psalmist says immediately after. So he's feeling cut off and separated from God, but says, yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried and were rescued. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. So I'm going to skip over the next 20 verses here. So that was, but you see, right, it's already starting to create this crescendo. The psalmist, he feels abandoned, he feels forsaken by God. He says he's seeking God, but God can't be found, it seems. And yet, what does the psalmist do? He remembers that God is a God of deliverance. He delivered Israel, and he will deliver his people always. And our Messiah on the cross starts citing this psalm of hope and redemption and restoration. And so then he goes on, like I said, it's kind of this crescendo of remembering who God is, right? Understanding the faithfulness of God, even when things seem hopeless. And it ends with this. So I'm going to pick up now at verses 25 to 31. From you comes my praise in the great congregation. My vows I will perform before those who fear him. The afflicted shall eat and be satisfied. Those who seek him shall praise the Lord. May your hearts live forever. All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before you. For kingship belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. All the prosperous of the earth eat and worship. Before him shall bow all who go down to the dust, even the one who could not keep himself alive. Posterity shall serve him. It shall be told of the Lord to the coming generation. They shall come and proclaim his righteousness to a people yet unborn, that he has done it. So what is the point? Why is Christ citing this small piece of a larger psalm? He's not confused. He's not asking God a question that he needs an answer to. He's quoting a psalm that starts with bleakness and despair, but that ends with a hope-filled look towards a glorious future where God will redeem his people, just as he redeemed them, in Egypt and throughout the Old Testament. God will fully and completely redeem his people in the future. And Christ is pointing to a future that he is purchasing for his people, right? It is through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ that we have that hope in that future, that we can say, God, I was hopeless. I was far from you. And even sometimes today, it can seem like God is distant, that things aren't getting better. But we can remember who God is, that God redeems his people, and he has done so through Jesus Christ on the cross. So in Jesus himself using a synecdoche on the cross, he is pointing his listeners and us today not to despair and doubt and confusion, but to a solid hope, remembering that because of the character of who God is, we have hope. We have a future restoration. We've got that glorious future that we're looking forward to. And we can understand Christ's words on the cross through a synecdoche, right? And we better understand it now because of that. So now, before transitioning into how epistle writers use Satan as a synecdoche, we can actually see Jesus himself use Satan as a synecdoche. So in Matthew chapter 12, verses 22 to 26, this is the famous one that leads into, blasphemy of the Holy Spirit is the unpardonable sin. Not going to get into that today, but that is where this is leading. But so what it says here, though, is then a demon-possessed man who was blind and mute was brought to him, Jesus, and he healed him, so that the man spoke and saw. And all the people were amazed and said, "Can this be the son of David?" But when the Pharisees heard it, they said, "It's only by Beelzebub, the prince of demons, that this man casts out demons." Knowing their thoughts, he said to them, "Every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and no city or house divided against itself will stand. And if Satan casts out Satan, he is divided against himself. How then will his kingdom stand?" So why do I argue that this is a synecdoche and that Jesus is using Satan to represent something bigger, namely his kingdom? Well, think about what's being said here. So the Pharisees are saying Jesus is using the power of Satan to cast out demons. He is not being indwelt by Satan and casting Satan himself out of this man, right? They just, in this normal conversation, we can see part of their culture was to say that someone who is possessed by demons is being, in a way, possessed by Satan. Not that Satan himself is a demon, but that these demons are part of the kingdom of Satan, just like sickness and sin itself, right? Paganism, all that stuff, all of that was a part of Satan's kingdom. And so you could just attribute it to Satan, meaning all the stuff that you could lump into what he is the God over, right? Everything that is not God is, in a sense, of Satan, him being proclaimed the ruler, the God of this world. And so Jesus uses Satan as a synecdoche, saying that if Satan were to give Jesus the power to cast out demons, that would be ridiculous. Why would Satan give the power to cast out Satan? Why would Satan give the power to undermine his own kingdom, right? His own kingdom of darkness. Jesus points out that's ridiculous. That doesn't make any sense. And it's true. But here we see that Jesus isn't talking just about, an individual being casting out an individual being, but that individual being representing all of this, in this case, all this demonic possession that, the land was facing at the time. And so here we see, again, very few people, even those who would say that, Satan personally attacks us, he whispers lies to us, he whispers accusations to us, none of which is biblical. Again, check out my series. But even people who would say that would not say in this instance that Jesus is saying that Satan himself is casting out just Satan himself, but that Satan represents, is used to represent this kingdom, right? These demons and all this misery and sin cursedness of the world that people were dealing with. People would agree with that. So it's not that far-fetched to understand that maybe whenever we see things about Satan in the Bible that don't make logical sense with everything else we see in the Bible, that maybe Satan represents something larger that the author is talking about. So when then, as we kind of wrap this up, so when do we see Satan used to represent a world that is against God, right? Not just Satan personally attacking every individual, even though, again, he can only be in one place at one time. So if he is whispering lies to me, he can't be there, and therefore whispering lies to you, right? And Satan's not all knowing. He's not all seeing. He can't see what I'm doing and what you're doing and, look for the ideal time to come tempt us. No. Whenever we see Satan used in these contexts when it comes to personal temptation of God's people, it means the world system, right? The allure, the enticement that the world has to draw us out of the kingdom of God and towards this kingdom of darkness and sin. So where do we see it? Well, the first place we see it, or not the first place, but one place we see it is in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 18. Paul says, "Because we wanted to come to you, I, Paul, again and again, but Satan hindered us." So Paul is saying that Satan stopped him over and over again from coming to visit this church in Thessalonica. Well, that seems pretty cut and dry that, Paul was trying to do it, but Satan was going and he was attacking Paul and he was personally engaging with this apostle to stop him. Now, Paul's a pretty big deal, so maybe we can make the argument that, Satan knew. He's like, oh, I know where Paul's going. I gotta stop him. I don't think so, because what is Paul talking about? We actually see how, quote unquote, Satan or a world system given over to being against God stopped Paul from visiting Thessalonica. So check out Acts chapter 17, verses 1 through 9 with me. Now, when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica. Again, this is the church Paul is talking to, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, "This Jesus, whom I proclaim to you, is the Christ." And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks and not a few of the leading women. But the Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob, set the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out to the crowd. And when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also, and Jason has received them, and they are acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus." And the people and the city authorities were disturbed when they heard these things. When they had taken money as security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. So, what prevented Paul from being able to visit with the church in Thessalonica? What did we see originally stood against him? We see no hint of Satan here. Now, you could make an argument that, Satan came and whispered lies to the religious leaders there and all that. But ultimately, I don't think Satan really needed to do much, right? Here you had religious leaders. Paul went to the synagogue. He kind of went to their place of business. And as we saw, the Jewish religious system of that time was incredibly corrupt, right? It was fully sold out on obtaining power and cozying up to the pagan government of Rome and finding power through that. And just as Jesus threatened the authority of the Pharisees, so too, as Paul comes in here proclaiming Jesus, these religious teachers in the synagogue saw that Paul was threatening their base of power. And so what did they do? Because they loved power more than they loved God. Because they found salvation and identity and rest and power and prestige and fame and money and whatever, instead of finding those things in the promised Messiah, they got a mob together. They spread lies, right? They were willing to possibly kill Paul and anyone associated with him. So here, we don't really need Satan for those things, right? These people were fully capable of loving the world more than they loved God. And they acted, I think, possibly fully on their own with no spiritual intervention necessary. And so then when Paul is saying, we wanted to visit you time and again, but Satan prevented them, Paul is pointing out that these religious leaders who would open what we would call the Old Testament and taught from it and claimed to represent God, they didn't represent God. They represented Satan. They represented a system, a belief fully against God. It didn't matter that they claimed to represent God. It didn't matter that they used God's name positively and taught from the same text that Paul was teaching from. That wasn't the point. They didn't represent God. They represented this world that is sold out to Satan. So that's what Paul means. Not that Satan attacked Paul. Satan probably wasn't even paying attention at the time. He's got other stuff, which again, you can watch my series to see what I think Satan may have been up to at the time. But again, that's where we see Satan is a synecdoche representing these religious leaders and the worldview system that they held to, right? They're craving for power. And the fact that despite claiming to have the truth of God, they were 100% completely lost as to the genuine truth of Jesus Christ. We can see it again. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 5. So talking about, husbands and wives, do not deprive one another, speaking of physical intimacy, except perhaps by agreement for unlimited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So again, what's going on here? If a husband and wife isn't physically intimate long enough, Satan's going to come in and be like, oh, okay, their 3 days of lack of intimacy is up. I'm going to get them now. No, Satan's not omnipresent. He doesn't know whether, how often a man and woman are physically intimate. He's not, omnipresent, knowing what's going on in their hearts and in their minds at the time. He's not going to travel, right? Because Satan can't teleport. We talked about that too. Satan isn't going to travel from where he is to tempt one couple into committing adultery, essentially. So what is Paul talking about here? Well, Paul's point is this: sex keeps married couples physically satisfied with one another. Paul is commending regular physical intimacy. He says the only reason that you should not be having, regular intimacy is if you choose to go into a sort of fasting and saying, we are going to set aside this physical enjoyment, just like people would fast from food. Married couples can fast from physical intimacy in order to pray, right? In order to intensify mourning and focus more on God and things like that, but not for too long, right? Because their lack of self-control might end up leading this good thing into a bad thing. You also consider the context of where Paul's writing. Paul is writing to the church in Corinth, a pagan city that had temple prostitutes, right? It was a very sexual culture. And so Paul is essentially saying to them, if you're going to, be physically intimate on the regular, if you're not going to be, then only let it be for a brief time and return to it, so that as you are depriving yourselves by intention for the sake of prayer, you are not tempted to then look around outside and say, I have physical needs that aren't being met and I don't have the self-control to keep denying myself. So I'm going to look at my neighbor's wife. I'm going to, find a reason to wander by the local temple and maybe, look at the temple prostitutes and then do it again and again. And after a long enough time, go in there and pay for a temple prostitute. That's what Paul's getting at. He's not saying Satan himself is going to personally attack them. He's going to personally tempt them, but that the things of Satan, the things of the world, the things that are not of God are going to lure them away, right? They're going to be enticing, and in their flesh, they're going to want to be drawn towards these things that will be harmful to them because they don't lack the self-control to stay fasting long enough. Which, side comment, Paul kind of implies, married couples, that you should be having intimacy regularly enough that it is not leading you towards wanting things outside your bounds. Again, Song of Songs for Single. Highly recommend the book. So, last one then, right? Everyone's kind of famous one of, well, if that's true, then what about James chapter 4, verse 7? Now, of note, we only quote half of James chapter 4, verse 7, which says, resist the devil and he will flee from you. Well, that sounds pretty personal. I have to personally resist the devil and he will personally free from me as an individual, right? Now, this is where our Christian traditions, even though tradition can be a very helpful thing, sometimes we can interpret the Bible not through the text itself, but we will put our traditions first in our minds and then read the Bible and say, well, this is what it means because my tradition says this is what it means. So what does James mean when he says to resist the devil and he will flee from you? Because I'm going to read the full context and you're going to notice how little Satan himself is actually a part of this. And in fact, if you were reading it completely unhitched from your Christian traditions, your first thing would be, whoa, James, where did Satan come from? That is super random and unrelated to what you seem to be talking about, unless you're using a synecdoche. So what does James chapter 4 actually say? So let's start at verse 1. What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. Side note, take that, prosperity gospel. You adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Are we paying attention, synecdoche learners? Or do you suppose it is to no purpose that the scripture says, quote, he yearns jealously over the spirit that he has made to dwell in us? But he gives more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. Again, super random mention of Satan, right? It's just like this random name drop. He says it and moves on. It's not random, obviously, right? I mean, it was divinely inspired by God. James isn't just like making some, kind of random statement, but instead, what is going on here, right? If you've been paying attention, you've probably picked up what's happening here. James's entire focus, really largely the entire book of James, is loyalty to the world or loyalty to God, loyalty to your flesh, loyalty to sin, loyalty to your prideful way of thinking, or loyalty and humility to God. And so in the midst of, just chapter 4, when it's just, friendship with the world is enmity of God, saying they're adulterous people, right? They have committed adultery on their God by thinking like the world. That's literally, really all James says. You're thinking pridefully, right? You're focused on your wants, right? That is worldly thinking. And so James says that friendship with the world, not friendship with Satan, right? Not worshiping a false God, worshiping Satan. He's just saying being friends with the world, thinking, behaving like the world, right? Getting into fights because you're focused on worldly things, right? Indulging in your fleshly desires makes us an enemy of God. And so James lays out the problem here, right? He says your desires are at war within you, right? Your sinful desires are at war with the spirit within you, right? We can apply this similar thinking, Galatians chapter 5, walking in the spirit versus walking in the flesh. That's what James is hitting on here. And what is his rejection? We need to reject worldly thinking. We need to resist fleshly desires. And Satan is a representation of those things. These things aren't innocent. It's not like we can be like, oh, it's no big deal. Everyone wants security. Everyone wants a relationship. Everybody wants prestige and honor and respect. That's a normal thing. James is saying, no, it's not. It's not this innocuous, neutral thing. There is no neutrality in the Christian life. Either the things that we want are of God or they're of the world. They're of God or they're of Satan. That's why James seems to randomly name drop Satan, because they're interchangeable in what he's discussing. Satan is a representative of this whole larger system that creates these problems in our lives because we are so drawn towards these sinful things. But remember what James says in chapter 1, right? That it's not God who makes us sin. It's not Satan that makes us sin. It is us. We are lured and enticed by our own desires. We desire the things of the world. We desire this whole buffet that Satan has laid out for us. The things of the world aren't like these super obvious, like, sacrificing babies on the altar of Molech kind of things. The things of the world, the things of Satan are, finding identity in your psychological issues, finding identity and prestige in how much money you make and how you look. It is saying, I would be happy if I could just have a boyfriend or girlfriend, if I could just get married, if I could just have a child, then I would be satisfied. It is finding your identity in a political party. It is finding your identity, your purpose, your satisfaction, your hopes in anything other than God. And is it wrong to want a child? I hope not. I've got 4 of them. Is it wrong to want to be married? I hope not. I've got a wife. There's things in the world that are not inherently wrong. And so we don't want to think that, things are only obviously satanic when it's got, Satan's, logo branded on it. We can make anything satanic because of how our desires are reacting to it. We can rejoice in having children. We can trust God when he gives us a child, but we can trust God equally when he doesn't. Same with anything, having a high-paying job, being healthy, whatever it is, right? When our identity is in God, then we are not going to be friends with the world. We're not going to think like the world. We're not going to have fights amongst ourselves as Christians. We as Christians are not going to be constantly miserable because we're not going to be constantly putting our hopes in things that were never designed to satisfy us in the first place. And so when James is talking about resisting the devil, Satan is the devil, same thing, is a synecdoche for this larger world system, right? Anything that we are drawn to, that gets our desires, that gets our affections other than God, is never innocent. It is satanic. It is demonic. It is worldly. James also talks about that. Right? So it wasn't Satan. The church couldn't say, Satan's making us fight. In a way, he was, but not because he was doing anything personally, but because Satan has created, like I said in my series, he's created this world system. It's like a buffet with everything that appeals to us. It's got the worst, nastiest, most depraved sins. It's got prestige from knowing a lot of Bible knowledge, of finding our identity in our, the version of the Bible that we use, or the church we belong to, or whether we went to college, or what college we went to, or the amount of money we make, or whatever. Satan has created this whole buffet, this whole world system that has just warped and broken how we think and where we find our hope and identity. And that's why, again, I say, we don't need to be on guard against Satan necessarily. We need to be on guard against his schemes, against this whole world system that we have to fight against, not against the wiles of one guy out to get us, but against literally everything that we have to live in and through on this side of heaven. So again, there's nothing new here if you followed my series. There's nothing new here if you've just been around anytime I've talked about where we find our identity. But, if you haven't watched my series on Satan, I would recommend it, but I hope that this has been useful. If you have watched the series, I hope that all the talking around that I had to do on that last episode, just the word synecdoche. Understand that Satan is a synecdoche, unless it's literally talking about Satan, and context will tell us. I hope that it matters, but overall, as always, with the series, with this episode, I hope that it gets you really thinking about the life you're living, about the world you live in, about how, as I think James points out, there is no neutrality in your life. So just ask yourself, what are you loyal to? Where are your hopes? Where are your affections? What do you think about the most? What do you fear losing? What do you feel like you can't be happy until you gain it? If it's not Jesus Christ and the spiritual maturity that the Holy Spirit grows in you, if it is not awaiting future glory with your Heavenly Father, you need to resist the devil. You need to resist not his personal attacks, but you need to stop sniffing at the buffet that he's laid out and see the glorious feast that God has given you, right? The total satisfaction that we can have in Jesus Christ. So, as always, I hope this was valuable. I hope it was helpful. I hope that above all else, God is bigger in your mind, that Jesus Christ has been magnified in understanding not just Satan, but who we are truly loyal to, who we truly love, and how so much of our lives must be surrendered to Jesus Christ. Because if we don't surrender it to him, then we are going to be submitting it to ourselves, and all we are capable of doing under our own power is charging headfirst into that satanic buffet that promises happiness and satisfaction, but really just gives us food poisoning. So, as always, huge thank you to my supporters on Patreon, whose monthly support allows me to make videos like this. If you'd like to join them for a one-time or monthly donation, check the link down in the show notes, and Lord willing, I will see you all next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Onward in the Faith. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast and visit onwardinthefaith.com, where you can read hundreds of articles about every area of the Christian life. If this ministry is a blessing to you, there are 3 ways that you can support it. You can pray for Ray and Onward in the Faith itself. You can share this episode with others, or you can help with various expenses by visiting patreon.com/onwardinthefaith or following the link in the show notes. We hope this episode has encouraged you to keep moving onward in your faith towards maturity in Christ.